If you're somebody who deals with foot pain, plantar fasciitis, high arches, fallen arches, or any foot problems in general, you should probably watch the rest of this video. So we have about 25% of the bones in our body just within both of our feet, which should be a testament to how important our feet actually are for our normal day-to-day function. So when we're looking at foot problems, most problems in the foot can be correlated to dysfunction between the toes and the inability to move each toe independently. So when people have arch problems, they generally have the inability to flex their big toe. They can't push their big toe down without having their little toes go down with it. So every time I push my big toe down, you'll see that my arch actually contracts. And every time I push my little toes down, the outer portion of my arch contracts. Every time I lift my toes up, my bridge contracts. So when we're looking at foot problems, it can always be correlated to the inability to move each of those bones relatively independently. The musculature of your foot is dysfunctional because the bones simply just don't work. A starting point for most people who need to be training their foot is the ability to splay their toes. And so how do we work on toe splay is we pretty much just go through what full range of motion for our foot actually looks like. So if we go ahead and flex our foot, we'll feel our arch contracting to shorten, to squeeze, and pull all those bones inward. And then when I splay my toes open, I feel my bridge contracting, the top of my foot. And so we're gonna go through a series of just toe grabs, is what I call them, so that we can splay our toes and then grab downward. And the idea is that just like other tools in our tool belt is we're just trying to prime that tissue and drive the neurological awareness behind how well does the bones in our foot actually move so that we can have more productive training with the other tools in our tool belt that we're going to apply afterwards. So we'd probably go through a set of 10 or 15 toe grabs where we're grabbing and then splaying, grabbing and then splaying. And if that's something that's hard for you to conceptualize and wrap your head around, then just do the best you can, and with each rep, think, can I squeeze my arch harder? And can I splay my toes more and feel my bridge contracting? After we go ahead and prime the tissue in our foot, it would be good practice to work on big toe extension. Big toe extension is the ability to lift the big toe independently of the 4 other toes. And if you have the inability to lift the big toe up and you feel all the toes, there's nothing wrong with just working on general toe extension as a way to get comfortable moving your feet and then eventually working on independent movement of the big toe. And anytime I'm working on big toe extension, I am looking to feel the top of my bridge, the top of my foot contracting to hold the big toe up, and then I would relax it. Big toe up, feel the bridge contracting, relax it. There isn't a general rep scheme that I would prescribe someone when they're doing this. I would just be looking for you to subjectively say, I feel my bridge working, and I can more effectively lift my big toe independently of the rest. And it's gonna be a subjective anecdotal judgment call as to how many reps you need to do. Some people may need to do more than others. The opposite of big toe extension is big toe flexion. And I mentioned earlier that big toe flexion is correlated to how does our arch function. So if you can see here, as I simply just put my big toe down, we can see my arch begins shortening and it almost pulls up off the floor. If you get cramping in your arches, or you have fallen arches or high arches, yes, there could be a structural predisposition based on your bone structure, but more often than not, your arch is underdeveloped, it's undertrained. So a way to train it is simply move it and explore your current range of motion. So just like we did with big toe extension, where I want to keep the little toes down and lift the big toe up, I want the big toe down, little toes up. And then I lift my big toe up, lift my big toe down. If you feel cramping in your arch when you're doing this, hold it, breathe through it. That is undertrained tissue, and cramping is a neurological response to stimulating tissue that is untrained. You need to work through it and build tolerance there. So again, going through a series of big toe flexion, if I were to come up to my toe and pull up, there's actually active pressure pushing down, and then lift the toe up, lift the toe down. So big toe flexion extension is also a big part to glute function. And so people who have the inability to feel their glutes when they're exercising, yes, that can be hip related or pelvic related, but it also can be foot related. So there's a large correlation to big toe function with glute engagement. Not only do we need to have consideration for our big toe, we need to have consideration for the little toes. So yes, when we do big toe work, the little toes are doing their own part in that, but we also want to have the ability to almost articulate in accordion fashion. So we have imagine our toes are up and we're doing one toe at a time in an effort to literally just articulate movement of our foot. So we can open up range of motion with other tools like we do for other joints, right? Passive stretching, isometric contractions, which we'll go into in a bit. But a really big tool that most people need to work on to start with is simply just articulating movement, not just big toe extension and flexion, but the little toes being able to have dexterity between them as well. So as a starting point for most people, toe grabs, flexion of the foot, splay of the toes, big toe flexion, big toe extension, dexterity of the toes as individual movement. There also needs to be consideration for the position our ankle is in, because function of the foot and how well the tissue within the foot functions can also translate to dysfunction or function at the ankle. And so if I am working my toes, we can do this in plantar flexion, where my ankle is in this position, or I can do it in dorsiflexion. So if we were doing it in plantar flexion, I would slide my foot all the way forward up until I feel my toes wanting to come up. So you see, if I'm in this level of plantar flexion, my toes are coming up. So I'm gonna slide my heel back until my toes are down. So if I'm in this level of plantar flexion, as opposed to my foot just being here in less plantar flexion, less relative plantar flexion, it's gonna change the orientation in which the tissue in my foot has to function. And it's also significantly easier to train your foot in plantar flexion rather than dorsiflexion. So we can apply all those same tools, big toe flexion, big toe extension, as well as dexterity of the toes, while we're in plantar flexion of the ankle. So just like all the other training we do, we can add layers of complexity to this to more effectively train and have more specificity behind our training, depending what the needs are for the individual. But if we're covering all of our bases to ensure that there's no stone that's unturned, having my ankle in plantar flexion, it changes the sensation that I get within my foot when I extend my big toe, as well as flex my big toe. And it also changes the sensation I get in my foot when I do toe dexterity by articulating movement one by one like that. So again, to contrast that, we can do it in dorsiflexion as well, where my knee is over my toe. If I'm in dorsiflexion, it is considerably harder to move our foot, which I want you thinking, in what type of exercise are we in dorsiflexion where our foot matters? The bottom of a squat. And so people who often have issues at the bottom of their squat, we can correlate that they'll have foot issues in that position as well, more often than not. So again, while I'm in dorsiflexion with my knee being over my toe, we're going for the same principles. Big toe extension, big toe flexion, dexterity between the toes. And you can see while I'm in plantar flexion, I have a harder time moving my toes or while I'm in dorsiflexion rather, I have a harder time moving my toes individually, and that's okay. Generally speaking, when we're in dorsiflexion of the ankle, the foot is significantly harder to train. So again, in a nutshell, as actionable items that people should be doing on a regular basis are our toe grabs, where we're flexing the foot, extending the foot, splaying the toes. We have big toe flexion and plantar flexion, or in dorsiflexion. We have big toe extension in plantar flexion, and big toe extension in dorsiflexion. You can see my big toe doesn't go nearly as high when I'm in dorsiflexion as opposed to when I'm in plantar flexion. And then again, the ability to articulate movement and have dexterity between my toes can be done in plantar flexion or in dorsiflexion as well. And it's also worth acknowledging that our foot is conditioned to be walked on every day on a day-to-day basis, and it's a very resilient joint structure in that sense because it's evolved to be used as often as it has. So it takes a very long time to develop adaptations like that. And one of the simplest things that we could be doing for the health of our foot besides direct training is simply barefoot walking outside so that we can put our foot to use in the most evolutionarily consistent way possible.